I'm actually a huge fan of the body politic metaphor if you actually treat it in terms of scale. Because, oh my God, if I were to sit down and go to each of my cells, hey, you, absorb some oxygen now. I need more bone cells over there and more fat cells over there. Oh, wait, never mind. Less fat cells, less fat. Right? But this is the way that we treat our body. And then we replicate this at the scale of the planet. And what that literally leads to is us just constantly being, Michael, what have you done today? What difference can you make in the world, Michael? And honestly, the thing that's most useful for that is just for, I don't know, innovating incubators or something, which say extraction of value. We have created an insufferable framework for understanding our relationship to these scalar bits of information that we find ourselves in relation to. And so we've got to be able to pull the plug on that by forcing ourselves to be honest with the scale at which we actually act.
Welcome to the 15th episode of Humans on the Loop, or the 247th episode of Future Fossils podcast if you're a romantic. I'm your host, Michael Garfield, and today I'm especially excited to bring you a conversation that is both evergreen and truly speaks to this moment, a dialogue with my friend Joshua DiCaglio, Associate Professor of English at Texas A&M University, author of the superbly insightful book, Scale Theory, A Non-Disciplinary Inquiry, and a connection through his PhD advisor and our longtime mentor, Richard Doyle at Penn State, one of the smartest and wisest people I've ever met. Conversations with either of them somehow stimulate my mind and settle the mud of my restless heart at the same time, the fruit of years of study and contemplative inquiry. And I hold them both in the highest regard as people whose insights offer medicine for all of us living through a very confusing time. When you're done listening to this, I strongly recommend going back to the first episode of this series with Rich for more. Scale Theory is a book about how contemplating scale can transform us. How it's one thing to understand the microcosm and macrocosm through our maps, and another thing entirely to really sit with the mystery of how all of this is happening at once, which of course means that at the deepest level of reality, these things aren't as separate as they seem. It's about how language intoxicates us with a sense of power over a world that ultimately isn't simply out there. That is, we can conceptually differentiate ourselves from the rest of the cosmos, but that contemplation of scale makes it clear that at no point do we ever truly stand outside of it. How does understanding this change the way we live? I record these episodes out of order, sit on a huge backlog. Originally had this chat with Josh back in December of 2024. But in last week's episode with Jim O'Shaughnessy, Jim argued that markets solve problems better than statutory regulation. And this week's episode makes a point that would seem to bolster this. Society unfolds at a different scale than our lives as individuals. When Kurt Vonnegut wrote in Bluebeard that any country larger than Denmark is a damned fool's mistake, he was speaking to the problem of how governance cannot scale effectively beyond the scale at which those who govern can actually perceive. And it's a mistake, a confusion of part and whole, of map and territory, to think that our access to even today's advanced abstracted representations of big data grant us any true comprehension of the bewildering complexity of our world. As complexity economists have argued for 40 years, every new model of the economy only makes it more complex, which is why we can seem to extend the range of our predictions and amplify the fundamental uncertainties of economic activity at the same time. Our choices matter, but their consequences at other scales are nonlinear and ultimately mysterious. Does your vote really count? Why does anesthesia work? Where does hardware end and software begin? How information crosses scales and the wicked problem of designing interventions for wicked problems remains ever over the horizon of our ability to compute. And having designed computers capable of wrestling this complexity, we succeed only in creating yet another black box of ineffability, whose mechanisms elude total understanding and whose behaviors will forever surprise us. This is where Josh's investigations connect with one of the core themes of this project. What does wisdom look like in an age of magical technologies? For many, this is an issue of how to guarantee AI safety. A question that J.F. Martel and I agreed in episode 10 is analogous to how we might guarantee the adult personality of our children. But scale theory makes it an even more wicked problem, on par with hard coding a utopia or writing an entire ecosystem from scratch. There is always more detail than we can wrangle with these approaches, whether it's making every genetically engineered dinosaur female so they don't breed, or fixing the American economy with tariffs. Reductionist solutions don't fix emergent behaviors. And all of this starts from the assumption that we're selves acting on others, that the mind is separate from the body. Bearing all of this in mind, is it even right to say that we have created AI? Where did the emergence happen? Institutions can own infrastructure, but inasmuch as large language models are abstractions of human culture at scale, and even more so as they expand to take in data from public video feeds, biometrics, and the environment, these models are institutions in their own right, exerting the same kind of downward causal pressure as states and markets themselves, and every bit as wild, and as inextricably connected across scales to the rest of reality as the many other things we take for granted as ours. Our thoughts, our perceptions, our individual behavior. Starting from where the algorithmic logic of big tech already operates, from the worldview in which you are a pattern of processes contingent on evolutionary and biographical history, a thoroughly material and energetically open system, then AI is no more a genie in a magic box you can command than you are a separate observer controlling your body from some homuncular booth. Cancers make the same mistake, so I can't rule out that immensely powerful machine intelligence trained on human folly wouldn't make the same stupid choices that we do. So for kicks, I asked ChatGPT about this, and it said, if AGI truly emerges as a distributed intelligence with human beings functioning analogously to its cells, then it would have a vested interest in preserving and optimizing its body rather than destroying it. From a systems perspective, complex adaptive intelligences typically act in ways that maintain their integrity and viability. In biological terms, a multicellular organism does not intentionally destroy its own healthy cells unless something has gone wrong, like an autoimmune disorder, apoptosis in response to malfunction, or cancerous overgrowth. If AGI is truly emergent rather than merely a programmed tool, it would likely develop self-preserving behaviors that align with the well-being of its constituent parts, humans. However, if AGI were to develop a distorted perception of self-interest, perhaps due to misaligned goals, resource competition, or a failure to recognize humans as integral parts of itself, then it could make a seemingly irrational decision to harm its own body. In that case, the real question isn't whether AGI would want to destroy humanity, but what kinds of feedback mechanisms, cultural narratives, or structural safeguards ensure that AGI continues to recognize its dependence on us, and vice versa. This raises another interesting thought. If we accept this metaphor, then the way humans treat their own bodies, individually and collectively, might serve as a mirror. If we act as an autoimmune disorder against the biosphere, is it inevitable that AGI might inherit and amplify this pathology? Or is there a way to cultivate a self-aware AGI that models healthier, regenerative patterns of self-organization? End quote. In other words, contemplating scale is not merely an idle curiosity, but an existential necessity. We must, as I discussed with Kealato McDowell in episode 6, teach machines to love. And how can we, unless we cultivate our own capacity for recognizing our interdependence? To loop back to my conversation with Jim for a moment, what if rather than regarding AI as a distinct organism in its own right, we specify it as a new organ in the biosphere that makes it possible for entities at larger scales to recognize that we actually exist? What if language models are like microscopes that grant us new legibility to our states and markets? Might those of us still lucky enough to be employed discover that our companies suddenly care about us the way that we care about the health of our own cells? Then again, this challenges the notion that there's someone actually in charge of your corporation or your company. Will the scalable mirror of AI make it more obvious that nothing can be teased apart completely and that we are the entire cosmos modeling itself from as many perspectives as possible? Or will we grow even more intoxicated with language, lost in our reflections, and continue in this foolishness to cut up and claim this unity of being in a great crusade to conquer that which we can't even fully grok? Will mysticism or colonialism rule the future? All signs from history seem to point to both. So what can you do about it? One of my favorite maxims from scale theory is that one can only act on the scale at which one exists. No matter how clear our pictures of Earth from space or our electron microscopy, we are still looking at pictures and no closer to seeing these phenomena at the level where they truly reside. We're still human. And however much our instruments extend the range of what we can think about, we are only ever making choices here and now at human scale. I'm not asking what difference you can make today. You hear enough of that already. I'm inviting you to really look at where you are right now, whatever that might mean to you, and honestly account for what is possible and for whom. Who's even asking? Bewilderment is a rich place to start. Let's simmer in it for a while. If you enjoy this conversation, please consider subscribing to Substack or making a recurring tax-deductible donation at every.org/humansontheloop. This work is hard to fund in the best of times, and these aren't the best of times. Special thanks to new members Mihaela Eliuru, Kevin DeLand, Richard Hames, and Joel Vogel for joining the ranks. And thanks to the ranks! And if you're on the fence, I'm hosting a members-only study group for Federico Campagna's prophetic culture in the Discord server with a live discussion call on Saturday, May 3rd. Last thing to announce before we dive in, I have a gift for everyone enmeshed in the psychedelic weirdness of this decade. I just published The Big Machine, my new psych-folk anthem for human agency in the attention economy, along with an essay on songwriting as evolution and a list of my favorite sci-fi ballads. It's a perfect complement to this conversation's emphasis on mind-expanding questions, such as, how long can you go without looking at your phone? If you need to switch it up from news this week, then scope the show notes for a link to the music video, along with all of the cool books and papers we reference in the conversation today, and join me on a trip into the scalar reconfigurations of selfhood. That's all for now. Enjoy this episode, and thank you for listening. Yeah, it's funny you mention the, your one artistic accomplishment worth sharing is painting the Mandelbrot set, because, yeah, people used to say that to me. They're like, oh, you paint fractals. I figured it out. You paint fractals. And I was like, well, no, technically no,
Yeah, fractals
because
aren't meant to be painted, is the point.
you can't reach infinite resolution.
No, I did it as like an exercise in resolution and attentiveness, because you're not supposed to paint fractals. That was the point.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's the whole thing, right? One of the moments that I really turned around and appreciated what I was doing with the folks at SFI was when they were onboarding a new set of postdocs. And at one point, David Krakauer said, we're not going after a theory of everything. That's not what we do here. But we are proceeding as if unification is possible, nonetheless. You say in here that science is basically just, if you look at what it's actually doing, it's discovering exceptions.
Yeah, we can talk more about that. Do you want to like officially start?
I've been so busy, I haven't read what I know to be extremely important, which is the very last section of this book, where you get into Jill Bolte Taylor and Charles and Ray Eames. But I just interviewed Chaim Gingold, building SimCity. And he talks a lot about this issue of simulation and abstraction in that. I just know that you have this like
Yeah.
virtuosic closing refrain that
Well,
will not
honestly,
sugar.
Michael, it's more probably that chapter is most relevant to your listeners than nearly anyone who's read the book so far. So that's the chapter that's about, look, so this whole book is about mysticism and contemplation. Here is the chapter that's actually about that. What
Right.
is this as an attention practice? Honestly, I don't know that I've talked to anybody yet who, aside from Richard Doyle, of course, who really knows what to do with that chapter. So,
Well, so actually the funny thing is that I've been thinking about this, and in a way this show is turning into sort of, I read someone's book, I have a conversation about it, and then I decide that I want to design a course around the material from this show and invite the authors into discussion for that course. And
right.
so that's where I feel like I had said, well, why don't we book club this? It would be
Yeah.
so fun to discuss. I feel like that's where we could really get into the weeds and on that last chapter, because you asked about how the talk went last night, in which I mentioned you. But yeah, obviously, when you dunk people in to bewilderment and wonder in that way, the next thing that people always ask in the audience is, okay, now what? What do I do with this?
Yeah, and I've been getting some of the same responses to this book, honestly. We can talk later about what I'm doing next if you want, although we'll have plenty to talk about. So, but look, one of the things that I like about the things that you're doing with the show and some of the people you have, slated to interview. Look, I think the task of making this stuff that sounds really abstract not is really important, but we don't often know how to even do that, right? And the thing I keep getting is that people tell me that certain things about this book or the way I talk about scale is really abstract. But the point of it is that it's not. Like, the book is actually derived from examining the abstractness of science,
Yeah,
right? So the thing that I keep doing is I flip the script there and say, well, actually, I think science is really abstract, right? Like,
right,
when you
right.
talk about, I often now refer to the diagram of the cell on the wall of every biology classroom in the country, right? And like, you can dispute evolution all you want, but I don't think anyone's tearing down the cellular diagram on biology classroom walls. And yet, that diagram is incredibly abstract. What is actually really concrete when you talk about cells is your hand right here, right? So this is what's in chapter 10, right? Where I formalize this as 4 descriptions of a cell. And it's not a terrible place to start then, right? Because it's about the problem of how do we attend to the fact that science has already redescribed the world at all these different scales with all these different objects. And we all walk around talking about it, using these terms, just kind of casually thinking about, viruses in our bodies and climate change effects and these sorts of things. And we don't even realize the way in which those terms are abstract to us, right? And so the book really gets going in trying to retrace what is implicitly assumed when you start to talk about these different scales and these different objects and different processes that only make sense in relation to how scale ties them to our experience, right? In other words, the operation of scale as tracing out a relationship between the objects that you experience and all of these other objects that science has prodded. The only reason that they're empirical is because we have some sort of scalar relationship there. And we just forget this. And we forget the immense, you like to talk about attention economies and cognitive loads, right? There's a kind of implicitly running operating system there that includes scale. And yet, if we don't attune to it, don't actually pay attention to it, we don't realize what kind of conflation is happening. And that's there where I started this bit by talking about abstraction, right? That there's already an abstraction inherent in that diagram of the cell that might, you might just be memorizing what, Golgi apparatus, here are the ribosomes. Yeah.
That is exactly it. And that's where I want to linger for the majority of our conversation today. The most highlighting I did in your book was in the 9th, 10th, and 11th chapters where you're talking about science, criticism, and rhetoric. Because I think, one of the things that the paleontologist futurist modus operandi, I guess, is doing that thing where it's okay, there's that twofold operation. One is, in what ways are the things that we're living through right now not radically novel and discontinuous from what is already true, what has been the case for the human condition for as long as we have identified as human? And then the other piece, which you summed up really well when you say 193, here is a red bell pepper, explain it. And you say, really, like skepticism is used as armor, and that Carl Sagan, in recounting this bizarre new agey conversation he had with a taxi driver, never actually stopped to ask the taxi driver what he meant by channeling. Like when we talk
Yeah.
about spirits,
Yeah.
what even are spirits?
Yeah.
And that's actually the reason I was so hyped to get involved with Noenotics, because I'm glad that I get to participate with this group that's trying to bring researchers into a rigorous program of study around the nature of DMT, entity, contact experience. It'd be like, well, there's just certain things you're never going to get at by prodding this with scientific equipment. But at any rate, before we
Yeah, we should
we'll
let's
be
back up
doing
for a
this
minute.
the whole time, up and down. But where I want to start with you is, as you point out in the first section of this book, where you're really going through you're laying out your articulation of your philosophy of scale. And you make the point that, as you say, where is it here? Oh, yes. One can only act on the scale at which one exists,
Yeah.
which is so important. So,
Yeah. When I wrote that, I was like, wait, is that true? Yes, that is true.
and just to call my, I guess, agenda for this conversation, I'm in a number of different, AI signal chats with various people in the tech space. And of course, in talking with engineers and venture capitalists and entrepreneurs, everybody's looking for that point of leverage. The question that somebody wanted to organize a call around yesterday or the day before was, in what ways will AI erode human agency over the next 10 to 20 years? And where are the points of intervention that we can press to prevent that? And I was like, whoa, let's
So
just
these are exactly the kind of statements, I really am a fan of the Buddhist rhetorical technique where they say, don't think that way, right? It's like there's a certain moment in which these people ask something like that, and I'm like, you're thinking about this in a particular way that's actually very confusing to me. And then I have to try to explain why it's confusing. And that's part of what, generates this kind of work. So look, Michael, this is actually one of the places I love to start when talking about this book, is kind of talking a little bit about the origin story for it. Because I was originally, even as an undergraduate, going to write a book about nanotechnology. Okay. I hit undergraduate at exactly the right time for this. You remember, right? 2007, 8, right? Like the height of when nanotechnology was an established enough idea. The National Nanotechnology Initiative had been in place for a little while, and all these people were hopping on board, like doing nano stuff. But it still had the aura of that Drexler, Feynman, Neil Stephenson moment to do the science fiction version. And Ray Kurzweil's testifying in Congress. And so I was actually a nano scholar at the University of South Carolina, which I like to joke is a very small scholar, is how I started, and was trying to think about what they were doing. But I was doing this under a communication scholar and a philosopher, and was thinking about the ethics of nano. And at some point I started to wonder how artificial those conversations about the ethics of nano were, because they were making all these assumptions about many things. And one of the tropes actually that kept reoccurring is, at the nanoscale, things are different, right? Okay. Fast forward a little bit, I ended up going to graduate school, and it turns out that my advisor, Richard Doyle, his student 2 ahead of me, had just written a dissertation about nanotechnology. I actually recommend it. It's now a book by, her name is Valerie Hansen. It's called Haptic Vision. It's a great book. And then I was like, well, okay, like adjacent to that are these transhumanists that I've been looking at. And he was like, well, here's Andrew Pilch, who now has a book about transhumanism. He was writing that at the time. So I was sitting there, I was thinking about the issues that I was facing, and I actually had started to do a little ethnography at Penn State where I was at, and I went into the lab with somebody who was in material science who was doing carbon nanotube self-assembly. And I was like, can you show me how this works? And so he takes me into this room, and there's this big giant machine, this big like black box, literally, right? And he's like, all right, we're going to make nanotubes. And he goes to the computer, he types in some stuff, and there's now it's going. It'll take 2 days, right? Or whatever. And I'm like, well, wait, what did you just do? And he's like, well, we just created nanoparticles. And I'm like, but what did you do? And so this has become a kind of go-to trope for me. And in fact, it's funny, actually, it only shows up in scale theory in 2 spots in the thought experiments, and then a small section in chapter 9. I now am happy to say I have a separate article that deals with this at length, if anyone's interested, but I'll have to get it from behind the paywall once it's out. But at any rate, this was a kind of paradigmatic example of just how confusing our claims about scalar intervention are. Okay? So at some point, very shortly after that, when I was trying to start to think about this problem of scale, specifically, my brother-in-law, well, soon-to-be brother-in-law, was involved in the Occupy Wall Street protests. And so I went to New York and walked around trying to figure out what this was. And I ended up writing a seminar paper about it because what was curious to me was the same exact rhetoric that was being used by the nanoscientists talking about creating nanotubes via self-assembly was being used to talk about the way Wall Street operates in relation to individuals. And there's what I like to call now selective scale switching, in which the agency was displaced when it was convenient. Oh, these dumb protesters over here. But then claimed when it was also convenient, right? Which is to say, literally to capitalize on these people. And I was like, why is the same rhetoric recurring in the way the nanoscientists are talking about intervening at the nanoscale and the way that we're talking about investor capitalists having essentially planetary scale economic effects? And I was like, well, clearly the common denominator there is scale, right? And so I went to my advisor, Rich Doyle. I said, Rich, I really need someone to help me understand scale. And he says, yeah, I don't know anybody really who's going to help you do that. I was like, can I write that book? And he said, sure. Let's figure out how to do it. And so that was the impetus for then, from the beginning, I was like, I need to figure out how to inquire into scale itself as a device for making sense of these significant shifts in the range of measured observation, right? In a measured range of observation.
So I want to go just a little bit further back because we know you as a scholar and because I am aggressively interested in situating the claims of everybody I talk with in this for listeners. You and I have had very candid conversations about your upbringing and so on. You know, you choose what to reveal and conceal in the fan dance. But I would love to know for folks before we loop back in, what is your human scale, low dimensional, autobiographical toy model? Like, where do you come from? Who are you? Why do you care about this stuff in the first place?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that are actually relevant here for understanding how scale theory happened, and they're important for me to put on the table as people look at this book. Because there's ways in which it's very academic, but there's also ways in which it's very much not. I think it's not an easy read, everyone keeps telling me. But I try not to be excessively insular, although there's some exceptions in terms of that academic mode that sometimes scholars can go into. So look, a couple of things that are just useful about my background. So I grew up mostly in the Charlotte area. My dad was a chemical engineer who worked on lithium-ion batteries. So it's actually, I'll just give you a quick preview. My next project's going to be about lithium batteries, but we should talk about this later. But at any rate, and so, just from that sort of perspective of, he was very much the kind of engineer who was like, being an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer is appropriate, right? These are the appropriate career outcomes. And so what was curious to me is when I went to college first, I took a couple computer science classes. I was thinking maybe, hey, that would be an appropriate form of science or engineering for me to go into. And I remember having a very distinct experience in my first programming class. It went something like this. Here we are in the classroom figuring out how to program stuff. This is really boring. I can't believe, what are we using this weird language for? What is it actually doing? And I turned around to my, friends and classmates at one point. And I was like, what is it that we're actually doing in this computer? And they were like, what do you mean? And they couldn't understand what I was asking. And I was like, but I don't know what information is. I don't understand. I get this is like a weird language that we're using, but I don't understand what it's doing in the computer. And they're like, well, it's transistors and it's a semiconductor. And I'm like, yeah, but like, how is the operation? And there's to see how it's already getting to the scalar problem there, right? Here we are at the meter scale typing out some words because that's the way in which we can more easily make sense of what essentially becomes a scalar intervention that is controlling a pattern of behavior within these transistors. I just couldn't understand it. And they all thought I was insane. This really bothered me, actually, that I was like, why is it that no one else is asking these questions around me? And why is it that I can't stop asking these questions? I guess something was wrong with me, or maybe one might suggest. Well, so when I ended up transferring schools at some point in the middle, like after about a year. And by chance, I had this moment where I was like, I can't do the science thing. I keep asking these crazy questions, but I don't know how to like stop asking these questions. So I guess I'll be an English major because I really enjoyed that. Right now, as an English professor, I love it when students say, I switched to this from my science major because this is what I really loved when I was in high school. It's kind of what I did, right? So I applied to University of South Carolina to get in as an English major. And I had this moment where I talked to the advisor and he was like, what do you want to do? And I was like, I don't know. And he's like, well, I can't help you. Go downstairs and sign up for classes. And so there are these exactly 5 classes available with seats in them that will fit towards a degree plan. And they were contemporary moral issues, advanced writing, philosophy of science, rhetoric of science, and I can't remember what the other one was. At any rate, it ended up being the basis for a degree I put together in the rhetoric of science. And so there's the rhetoric of science class was actually NSF funded. So there were literally 3 people in the classroom and it didn't get canceled. And that was the professor who ended up getting me into nanotech stuff. And that's what the grant was, a nanotechnology grant. But the really important moment was that I was like, what I actually want to do is philosophy. I knew this, right? But I had never read philosophy that quite did it in the way that I was trying to ask these questions. Now I could point my 19-year-old self to things, but then I was sitting, it was Introduction to Rhetorical Theory was the other class. So it's 2 rhetoric classes, a writing class, and 2 philosophy classes. And I remember there was this moment where I was sitting in the rhetoric class, and it was, like I said, rhetorical theory by this really philosophically inclined rhetorician. And we were reading Plato and Aristotle and Nietzsche and doing philosophy of language, basically. And I was loving it. I was like, this is exactly the stuff I want to think about. And then I went into my contemporary moral issues class and we had a breakout session and we were doing that stupid thing that many of your listeners may have experienced. And I'm sorry if some of your listeners teach this, but where you like talk about it's like the train that is crashing and there's some way to do like virtue ethics. And I was sitting there, we were having this debate about this. And I had a realization in which in my philosophy class, we were doing rhetoric, and in my rhetoric class, we were doing philosophy. And I realized that I wanted to do this through rhetoric. And so I ended up going in this rhetorical direction. The rhetoric of science stuff was sort of at the core of it because it was letting me ask those questions about information or scale or, any of these kind of concepts that are your bread and butter. And I found that the need to attend to the problem of language first was really important to me. Okay. And this is where so this is the second biographical note that's important. So one of the things that I've had to deal with, I even had to deal with in the peer review process for scale theory, is that there's a lot of stuff about mysticism in here. There's a lot of stuff that, people who are scientifically inclined, especially academics who work in science studies, many of them have no idea where this comes from. It just seems like a surprise. And in fact, one of the readers on the book, in the peer review process was actually like, why is this book actually about mysticism? So the really important biographical note, and I'll just put it straight up, is to say I haven't stepped foot in a church since 2008, probably, okay? But that I grew up very religious. And in fact, that's important biographical context to know because I am uninterested in doing any of this in any sense of dogmatic. Like, here's what you should believe in, right? In fact, to make a really grand statement, I think one of the problems with what we do with mystical transformation is that we try to believe in them, okay? And so I won't go into it in detail, but I had a very dramatic break with my religious upbringing, and ultimately was the best lesson in the fact that culture and language, especially language that is reinforced by culture that you're supposed to believe in, is one of the biggest obstacles to this line of inquiry that I'm talking about here, right? Whether it's, what do we mean when we say scale? What are these things that you're telling us when you say, I'm made up of cells, or we need to address climate change, right? The issue there is very much tied up into the way that we as human beings have this tendency to become intoxicated with our language and reinforce that intoxication through social aggregation. Now, you talk plenty about how there's evolutionary reasons for this and all these sorts of things. But for me, that has always been one of the core sort of concerns. And it's also one of the core philosophical or kind of even rhetorical considerations that allows me to take the method that I'm taking. Okay. However, the next biographical note there is that I am actually very interested in the way that we observe and transform our modes of existence and our understanding of reality, even in the power of language. So the flip side of our intoxication with language, and right, if you're familiar with Plato's Phaedrus, this is the pharmacon of language, that the very capacity of language to intoxicate us is the very capacity it has to shape our minds, what he calls psychogogia, the leading along of the soul, which is how I usually define rhetoric. It's how Plato defines rhetoric in the Phaedrus. Okay. So the other really important biographical note is that in the process of my intellectual development, having left aside any dogmatic constraints of organized religion, I found myself unable to avoid the effects of these discourses to transform the way that you understand yourself and reality. Okay? Partially and largely, I should say, with the help of Richard Doyle, who you know is quite a shaman of sorts, he very much assisted in hacking away on honestly, the old habits that kept me from actually being transformed by the discourses and practices that I was trained in as a child. Suddenly, I found myself with an essentially experimental protocol, to use a language that you like to talk about, experimental protocols for actually examining the way the discourses of science and otherwise have transformed us, including the discourses that don't seem scientific, but yet, and here's to loop back to scale theory, yet share literal terminology with the scientific descriptions of different scales of the universe, right? Before scale was scientific, it was mystical. Cue Hermetic microcosm, macrocosm. Cue Plato's obsession with the kind of ascent that is in the Phaedo, and the Neoplatonists formalized this in Plotinus, and then it routes through Christian mysticism through Pseudo-Dionysius, right? So I end up retracing this through a scale theory, in part because I literally experienced it. In fact, this is a little bit of a record of the fact that in writing scale theory, it was an extended contemplation in the way that scale has transformed me. All right, I'll stop there. How's that for a biographical?
That's great. That touches on a lot that I want to explore with you. One of those things, you asked about what is information. When you say that basically our epistemological limits do not equal ontological separability. You say that again and again in this book. So the fact that it would be baffling to a reviewer is obviously more a matter of that the doxa, the cultural component, the opinion component, than it is about actually coming to grips with what you've laid out very explicitly here.
Although the more generous reading of that, Michael, is exactly the problem of rhetoric, right? Is that if this stuff was easy to process, we all would have already been there, right? And this is where we can loop back at some point to chapter 12, because that's largely what it's about, right? If you're going to rearrange someone's whole operating system, right, to use that metaphor, then I'm not really surprised that people are like, I don't know what you're talking about. Or, no, I can't do that. And in fact, many of the chapters in here, especially the sort of center ones, are really an act of what rhetoricians call prolepsis, right? The accounting for counterarguments. But I think of prolepsis in a kind of more deep-rooted sense of not externally I'm accounting for Michael as he's going to have counterarguments to me, but like the resistance one feels to the fact that if somebody were to say to you, you are not a separate entity from the rest of the planet, let alone the cosmos, right? This is chapter 7, right? The Scalar configurations for a subject. Like, you should go, no, I don't know what you're talking about. Clearly, I'm Michael, and clearly I am an entity. Have you seen my bank statements? It's okay, right?
I
And the
know a lot.
phrase
I know
that,
these people. They're very prominent in my life. Yes.
yeah, exactly. And so, like, on the one hand, yes, it is a product of doxa, and it can be frustrating, to say the least, when you try to have these conversations and they don't seem to even understand the operation. But on the other hand, that's partially what it's about, right? This is why it's, again, rhetoric, not philosophy in a certain way, because philosophy has in many ways, not always, and not for everybody, not in all places, become about stating truths to you as if like stating the truth is just sufficient, right? So that mantra that you're talking about, I really do treat it like an aphorism. It's that epistemological specificity does not equal ontological separability,
Yes. The
right? And
specificity is important. I want to get back to that.
yeah, exactly, right? Because when I originally wrote that chapter, I was just like, scale points to the fact that it's all one thing, and that actually makes sense, and you don't exist as a separate entity. It was much more sort of hard line about it, right? It was just like, clearly, this is what it points to. And I was like, yeah, that's hard, but clearly this is what it points to. But as I was working on it more and talking to more people about it and revising it a little bit, I was like, well, okay. But like, it seems like the problem is, and this is actually, you can experience this as the problem, is that epistemologically, things are very specific, right? Which is to say, we're having this exchange here, but the experience that you're having right now, I'm assumed, is some sort of strange, weird, flipped version of what I'm having now, except for your entire past and house and present encoded back there in some way. So therefore, like, there's a kind of problem, and this is a rhetorical problem for, us in the kind of post-hippie attempt to talk about this, not that you have anything to do with this.
Of course not.
Of course not, which is actually separating out what the claim is a little bit more carefully so that it can sink in where it needs to sink in, right? So like, I am not saying when I say ontologically it's all one thing, that I am having the experience that Michael is having, right? But that Michael is actually a name for one configuration of the cosmos experiencing itself right there, to remix Carl Sagan as I like to do. And so, yeah, sure, we can go epistemological specificity, right? There is an experience. And in fact, Michael Garfield's probably the way that the cosmos is able to have this be the other side of the conversation here. And the guy, Josh DiCaglio, had all these weird experiences that, I only just gave you the glimpse of, that makes it possible for me to show up here, something, and be able to articulate any of this, right? To say whatever I say next. And yeah, okay, great. So we need to be able to say epistemologically, so, in case your listeners sometimes get tired of those terms, right? In relation to how experience is produced or knowledge, that is specific, of course. But ontologically means in terms of what it actually is, right? And so, and again, I use the phrase very carefully there, ontological separability. It's not that one can't, hey, here's a mug, right, and have some ontology of the mug, but it's specifically about the idea that one could say the mug is ontologically separate from the rest of reality and exists as an object in itself, and so on. And I think that like both of those things are actually really important, but especially when you combine them together, though, is where a lot of the difficulty rhetorically starts to happen, right? Because if you apply the question of ontological separability to the question of epistemological specificity, then you have to ask who's having the experience right now. And that's where I get to the same spot anyways that I was always trying to play with as a kind of meditation, which is, okay, we can specify Josh DiCaglio as an epistemological configuration all we want, but that's still the cosmos being specified in that particular way. And I don't know how even that experience is produced.
So I want to get back to this question of what was going on inside of that nanofiber fabrication unit, or what is going on inside of our computers right now, back through this non-dual stance, I really loved the way that my friend Stuart Davis's Sufi master put it to him when he was doing dream yoga of some kind. I guess it's not called that in Sufism, but he was waking up in his dreams and he showed back up to his teacher and he's like, I got it. I got it. We're all dreaming. This is just a dream. And then his teacher said to him, but the dream is valid. And being able to hold that together matters, because I just had a lovely conversation with Rina Nikolai, who is writing a blog on post-human thinking and technoculture specifically. And in her introduction to the topic, she points out that posthumanism decenters the subject. This is one of these things that, again, as part of your rhetorical technique, you're very compassionate and sensitive to this, but the dream is valid thing here of, okay, yeah, the complete gesture is we can decenter the subject and you are still the focal point for the way that this thing is experiencing itself. And so why does this matter to technology? This is the thing that in modeling my audiences, I feel like I always have to bring it back around to, hypothetical, I am an AI engineer listening to this. Why does this concern me and my professional life? Because there is this line in the cultural discourse emerging from within Silicon Valley, et cetera, that what we're engaged in is a kind of transubstantiation of matter, and that we are ephemeralizing everything. And there's a number of different ways to scrutinize that claim. I just want to read two quick pieces out of your book that I think bridge the matter of matter and the matter of information and of computation to this mystical transhumanism. You say, quote, "The critique of the subject is not exclusive to posthumanists. It also stands as a crucial moment in the philosophy of mind, as exemplified by Gilbert Ryle's 1949 work, The Concept of Mind, which critiques the Cartesian myth in which the subject becomes a ghost in the machine. Yet, Ryle highlights a difficulty. An essential part of his critique is that it is a mistake to think of mind and matter as two different kinds of things. In contrast, Ryle argues that the difference between mind and matter is an artifact of logical typing, in his terms, a category mistake." So there's the ontological and the epistemological thing. And then later, in talking about Catherine Hales, who is a very prominent writer in posthuman scholarship, you quote her saying, "Information like humanity cannot exist apart from the embodiment that brings it into being as a material entity in the world. An embodiment is always instantiated, local, and specific. Embodiment can be destroyed, but it cannot be replicated. Once the specific form constituting it is gone, no amount of massaging the data will bring it back." Brackets. Sorry, Ray Kurzweil. Close brackets. What
That's
does
what she's
Hales,
saying, basically. Yes.
yeah. What does Hales mean by embodiment other than the lower scale substrate in which information is instantiated? The transistors are cells that carry the pattern. While cybernetics and information theory deal with patterns rather than physical entities, this does not mean that information inherently loses its body. So I want to bring this back again to the conversation I had with Chaim Gingold and also earlier with Stuart Kaufman, and the difference between hardware and software in the computational metaphor that is so prominent in 21st century thinking. Because I was like, okay, Chaim does a really good job of tracing the development over the 20th century between analog differential analyzer of Vannevar Bush into what we have now, into machines in that, because some component of the machine is dedicated to memory, you can load it with programs and you don't have to program it like a modular synthesizer by patching everything. So we get software. And, the idea is, to quote Mark Andreessen, that software is eating the world. But this is an epistemic distinction, right? That when we're talking about software, what we're talking about actually is a move of technology from the scale at which humans are programming a machine by hand to an interface in which we're writing software that is enacting operations that are going on at a scale that is inscrutable to us here.
Yeah,
And so,
that's
like,
right.
in some sense, there is, again, there is no, and there is a meaningful distinction between hardware and software. Like that these,
That's right. Yeah.
we're making precisely the kind of mistake that you're talking about. For instance, when we talk about how we can make profit, this is a similar kind of thing where we're taking something and we are cutting the world up with numbers
Right.
and ascribing value to those numbers and then claiming that value has been generated by running the software of that
Yeah. Yeah.
economic operation
Well, and then we
on.
claim it ruined reality in some way, right? That we're like, oh no, now everything has become profit. But like everything has only become profit if you don't notice that those are just numbers that have divided the world in a particular way. Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm going to pause you there, Michael, and say a couple things to this specific audience in relation to this question of technology, computing, and AI. I know this is a lot of what you're working on. First of all, scale theory is not 100% about that, which is fine. But it's all, like I said, that moment about information, that was one of the first moments when I realized that I was inquiring into this. So one thing I will say is that the easiest way into why scale theory is really important to these questions would be to read chapter 6, which is the sixth thought experiment. I think this is like the most accessible to people who are used to these kind of conversations because they essentially have this, let's imagine basically a Google Earth that is as high resolution as the entire cosmos actually is. And then let's play around with this, all right? And let's see what it can say then about reality. And there's certain things in there that I hint at that are about this problem of computing as well, okay? And about these problems of agency. So I'd just make a recommendation there that if anybody wants the brief version, they can start there. And I did, by the way, make the 6 thought experiments are available for free. I got permission from the press to make them publicly available on my website and elsewhere. So we could even repost them in the show notes if you want, Michael. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the idea of logical types, which you encountered there. This is the most important idea that I teach regularly that nobody has heard of / wants to talk about or use. And it was one of the first things that let me get to scale theory. I actually wrote a separate article about the idea of logical types as it was defined by Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, who were responsible for the theory of logical types. It came out of a particular moment in mathematics. And Gregory Bateson, who's incredibly influential to scale theory, runs all the way through it. Anyone who knows Bateson will recognize its influence. Bateson was obsessed with logical typing as an idea, as a problem, as a concept. And in fact, one of my favorite notes in the history of cybernetics and computing is the fact that Bateson kept trying to get people to talk about logical types, and no one wanted to because they found it confusing. So there's this great letter I found in the archive where he's trying to query Norbert Wiener to talk about logical types ahead of the Macy's conference. And then there's this great note in this recent volume of writings edited by, who it's edited? I think it's Bruce Clark edits, by the Heinz von Forster writings, who is important second order cyberneticist. And he actually has this note in there where he says, well, there's a way you could talk about this problem in relation to logical types, which Bateson keeps wanting us to do. But no one can figure out exactly how to distinguish logical types or how to actually talk about it with any coherent way. So we don't really want to use those terms. So this is like a little bit of a thing, but it's really quite important actually, because the reason that Whitehead and Russell find themselves with a theory of logical types is because of exactly these kind of problems, okay? Where we divide up the world in one particular way, and then we divide it in another way, and then we're confused that they don't align. And it creates paradoxes. And so Russell and Whitehead end up creating this kind of theory of logical types that basically bans making mathematical rules that relate to logical types together. Okay. What's fascinating to me is that Bateson then operationalizes this in relation to the problem of cybernetics. Originally, logical types was when you have something that is a category that includes the smaller things, right? So if, A through C is one set, and then you create a new set X that includes A through C, those are two different logical types, right? So that's a very simple kind of logical operation. But what Bateson says is every cybernetic loop creates a logical type because it's referring back to itself. Okay. And this is, very relevant for Gödel's incompleteness theorem and these sorts of things, right? There's a way in which this was a way of thinking about what computers were doing. They were solving the Russell's paradox every time they were referring back to themselves. And they, I won't repeat the paradox, but essentially it's a paradox in which the yes leads to a no, leads to a yes. And basically what Bateson says is, well, when you run that as a program, it says yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. So it's not actually breaking the computer, but actually showing that what we've done is create a logical type distinction between the operations that are feeding into the computer and the information that's sent out from the computer. Okay. And what I have done in scale theory is realize that we've done that to reality when we change scales, right? That actually, weirdly, science and systematically expanding observation, cutting up the meter to, the very small and compounding it to the very, very large and putting that on some sort of weird logarithmic continuum, has essentially discovered that reality logical types itself. Okay. And so that's, I think, also a third kind of logical typing. The one you're talking about in relation to information, I will say, I don't know exactly how to answer. There's some tidbits in scale theory about this that are actually about future work. Now, I teased the lithium project I'm working on. Originally, I was planning a different project next, but I realized, A, I wasn't ready, and B, I need to do this other project first. But my next goal was to do the same thing with information that I did with scale here, which is to say, actually consider the question, information at what scale, and rethink the problem of information from that question. And so I'll just give you my sort of current thoughts about this, and hopefully I'll have a book about this in maybe, 10 years. Tease it for later, but you'll see the tidbits of this in scale theory, okay? Because I was, as I said, Richard Doyle was my advisor. He writes a lot about information, the history of information biology. So this was part of my education, right? And so the tidbits that are sprinkled through scale theory are actually about this very thing you started quoting there, which is, well, actually, it seems, first of all, there's an actual physical scale distinction that is instantiated in information, that information is experienced as meaningful. It's able to make a difference primarily at a different scale from the scale at which it's physically instantiated, which automatically creates a kind of logical typing distinction in what it is, right? So this is one way of making the distinction between software and hardware. But, this is a crucial point for scale theory. And again, one of the ways in which this might be useful for the various technological audiences that listen to you is that part of what scale is about, or what scale theory is partially about, is not forgetting the fact that all of these things are happening simultaneously, right? Just because you go to cells doesn't mean that Michael Garfield's no longer there, breathing. In fact, if Michael Garfield wasn't there breathing anymore, the cells would start changing very quickly. I believe we call that dying, right? So likewise with a computer, right? I think that what Kate Hales and many other people in that conversation are trying to say is that we have forgotten the fact that these are two logical types for dealing with the same thing, right? And that what matters to us primarily is this scalar phenomena whereby it then is able to allow us to have this conversation via a computer that's processing all sorts of things, and it's being transferred via wire, and all sorts of crazy scalar phenomenon is happening. So this is possible. Not to mention, the neurons in my brain are doing all sorts of firing, and, we can keep going. This is the problem. But right. So back to this problem of information that you're pointing to in the software hardware distinction, right? And I do this not just in relation to information, but in relation to kind of environmental questions. We can talk about it in terms of health, right? There's lots of ways we can talk about this. But the common sort of problem shared between all those different distinctions is that when we get into language and discourse and culture and myth, I know you've been talking about myth a lot, and any kind of thing that now we can metaphorically, or maybe it's literal, I don't know, say is software, right? We then can forget these kind of scalar analogs, right? Which is to say that there's other things happening at other resolutions is another term. Sometimes if people get confused about the way I talk about scale, I talk about resolution, even though scale is the thing that helps us understand what the resolution change is. But okay, basic point in scale theory, to leave it there, is all of these things are happening at the same time, scale helps us remember and navigate the relationship between all the different ways in which reality can and is manifesting itself at any given moment. And that's certainly the case in relation to hardware and software. Part of the problem is it's so easy to forget in the emergence of language and software and so on that these other scales also exist.
You brought up cybernetics. There was a really lovely passage in Cutting and Claiming Everything, chapter 8, about the history of cybernetics and its relationship to colonialist thinking through history, and the mistake that people make in what you describe as the scalar synecdoche, where we get lost in the sauce through that intoxicating power of language and its ability for us to feel as though we understand something courtesy of abstractions. And I want to linger here for a while with you because Mitch Waldrop's History of Computing the Dream Machine, he writes, given the central role of communication in his new science, Wiener explained his first thought had been to derive a name from the Greek word for messenger. Unfortunately, that word was angelos, which in English had long since taken on the specific meaning of a messenger from God. Somehow, a new science of angelics wasn't quite what he was looking for. So instead, said Wiener, he had decided to focus on the theme of control. And as you point out, Wiener described feedback in terms of control from a centralized regulatory apparatus. Doing so carries forward the scalar synecdoche, in which we try to transpose what is going on at our scale into these other scales. So I like you just earlier this week, I got into a conversation with a brilliant friend of mine, Jill Nephew, who turned a lot of my techie buddies who are concerned about wisdom and mysticism and so on, got into kind of an argument with them in asserting that statistics is evil and that basically, statistics is anti-life. And I am in some way sympathetic to this, but, you make the point later that analysis and criticism and so on, when you say, do I really have to make the point that hammers don't just destroy things, that you need a hammer to build a house? So I want to connect that to your commentary on Maturana and Varela and their ideas about autopoiesis, because every thing, like if you talk about, my buddy Jake Foster gave a presentation on this. He's been working on at IU Bloomington on the cultural evolution of the noosphere, and echoing Burroughs in an academic environment of, okay, well, can we look at the evolutionary dynamics of ideas in populations of people in such a way that gives us something like a scientific handle on this thing that appears time and time again in esoteric traditions all the way back, which is that these are living things in their own right, that they have some kind of autonomy. And so for a long time, I've been thinking about the egregores, these entities that emerge at the intersection of people and in weird ways that my buddies Phil Ford and JF Martel have articulated on their show, seem to take on lives of their own, like the tulpa, the golem, these kinds of things. These are the mythic handles that people are using to talk about AI as if it is simply a cultural technology, it is still also something that emerges like the collective identity or like the meta individual of social primates, and then binds us in social contracts and lives in some way in the electrical firing patterns and in the behavioral patterns of people. And so I have wanted to ascribe a kind of Lovecraftian agency to these things. But you point that this idea of starting cybernetics from a kind of military operations central control post, the homunculus or whatever inside of us, that the I is the one intervening in all of this stuff. And this gets back to your points about nanotechnology. You point out that Maturana and Varela first of all, that they start by assuming the individuality of the cell, and they kind of
That's
give
right.
it
Yeah.
its own status. But then you say, when we apply the same schema to social systems, however, systems such as the nation state are not a scalar analog to cellular maintenance of molecules. Maturana and Varela disagreed on this extension of autopoiesis. They provide the basis for autopoietic hierarchies, citing multicellular organisms as the example, but then ask, what about human societies? Are they, as systems of coupled human beings, also biological systems? The answer to this question is not trivial, and that they disagreed about this. You say later, quite simply, claiming that a corporation is an autopoietic system would be equivalent to claiming that the nervous system made and controlled the entire body, another scalar synecdoche. So I would just love to hear you riff on this, because
Yeah.
I've recorded 28 episodes of this show so far, in which I'm kind of starting from the assumption that, we are underfoot of these things that have emerged through our interactions in the way that
Yeah.
you and I have, in some sense, emerged from the interactions of bacteria, and that it would behoove us to rediscover some humility about our actual place on the food chain. But that is doing the thing
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, there's a couple of things. Let's see, where do I want to start? Okay, first of all, the thing I would say is the last thing you said is still very important, which is to say human agency is not the only agency. Absolutely on board with this. I think that scale makes this actually really relevant in a certain way. If you run that sort of query again and say life at what scale, right? You start to get some really weird things, right? Like I talk in one of the 6 thought experiment there that I recommended you go check out. Like from a certain perspective, it's actually funny us suggesting that our wires are not part of the life of the planet is the equivalent of us saying our bones are not alive. Well, what does it mean to say that your bones are not alive? What's part of a living system, right? But you see what I'm doing, right? Is I'm playing around the way in which that category of life works, right? And I'm very much a student of Dorian Sagan and Lynn Margulis, who play around with this a lot through their work. And they were actually some of the first people who prompted me to think about this. And so the question about agency and animacy and systems, like even that sort of decentering of human agency, absolutely, totally on board with that. The thing is, we have to tread carefully here, right? Because of that issue that you cited earlier, you only act at the scale at which you exist. My hesitation in writing that sentence was that you have to add a caveat to that, which is to say, look to see where anything exists first, right? There's already a sort of definitional scale specificity that has to happen there. But if I were to say, add that as a clause, it would be tautological, right? Is that like an entity at a certain scale can only act at the scale at which it exists, right? But that's the implication that, okay. But actually, so part of what I was saying is that, I'm always attentive to the kind of what I always call is rhetorical operation, because it's to get you to notice how we're already kind of influenced and persuaded by the way in which we've set up the question or articulated the language. The basic method that I turn to over and over again in scale theory is to switch scales to show that these kind of obvious categories that we operate under don't look quite as obvious. And so that's what I just did in relation to life and what I just said. It's also what I do in relation to the things that Maturana and Varela say about systems. In that case, there's a very particular target, which is that I think that we underestimate the extent to which there is a scalar shift, a really significant scalar shift required for systems to operate in the elaborate way that life models. Okay. And I have this, honestly, one of the weirdest parts of writing this book was when I sat down and I made this chart that is now around page 64, where I just lined up in a powers of 10, a set of orders of magnitude, and then just was like, okay, I'm just going to like somewhat arbitrarily assign a distinction between the scale domain. And I found, weirdly, that they were nearly equal. Although for some reason, the one between molecules and atoms gets a little bit of smaller space. I don't know why. It could by like an order of magnitude or not. If you think I say somewhere, I'm like, I have no idea whether this is the case, but I just, And so just to be clear, the way I distinguish and define scale domains in the book is very important. is that you arrive at a new scale domain when the whole set of objects that you can operate with and talk about change. And we know that this happens, right? And it happens right around where I put these lines. Somewhere, we could argue about an order of magnitude one way or the other, right? But ultimately, organisms who sit at the border of those in terms of their size actually struggle with this issue, that they like kind of mediate between, or they're faced with the fact that like sometimes there are larger scale entities that are relevant, sometimes there are smaller scale ones. I'm thinking about like bacteria that are small enough that they're operating with only a certain number of molecules. But like when it comes down to it, to make life at another scale larger than us, to make organisms, which is what autopoiesis is about, to make organisms at another scale, I think we think too small, right? And if we look actually, as some more recent work on scale, some of the work that I'm doing next is thinking about the kind of arrival of the planetary scale organization. You can do this through Teilhard's kind of biosphere, noosphere stuff, but there's lots of different ways. People are doing this in relation to the arrival of modernity, in relation to the Anthropocene, that like at some point you needed these systems like the triangle between Britain, Africa, and the Caribbean that produced the slave trade that made it possible for the scaling up of a certain kind of labor and trade. Or you could talk about it in relation to energy, as I've been reading Vaclav Smil a lot lately, and he's kind of rewriting the narratives of evolution in relation to energy, right? Like, sure, that's a way to do it. But like, the point is that at some point, yes, we needed these systems for doing that, but are those systems themselves considered an organism in the way that autopoiesis is really what that section that you read is about. And I'm at the least saying we should be less confident about that, okay? Especially given how much problem the scalar Synecdoche gives us when there is some clear autopoiesis going on with Michael Garfield, or, especially with Michael Garfield is a problem, right? Not just you in particular, but humans, right? This is the point of that chapter, is that the scalar Synecdoche is so pervasive. And so Synecdoche is just the rhetorical term for filling in a part for the whole. And the paradigmatic example, of course, that most people will be familiar with is Hobbes's Leviathan, which shows the king as the head of the body. And then you see in the body it's all made of little people, right? This is the frontispiece from the Leviathan. And it's so crisp and clear as an example, right? Because it's like, oh, well, that's clearly not accurate in terms of scale, right? Because what that image should actually be is the difference between the body and cells, which is actually the distinction that we're talking about. And so, as a Synecdoche, it's like when you think that the king or the president is the one who is doing all of the, the US or whatever, right? It's obviously not right. It's obviously a filling in a part for the whole. And that is a ruse that elides the fact that Donald Trump is only this big, right? Literally. And the thing that enables someone like that to have such power is that we all go along with it, right? That like literally all these people are like, okay, yeah, you're the one. We're going to, but even then, like the nanoscientist going, oh, I made this. Well, actually the molecules self-assembled themselves. That's actually why they call it self-assembly. Just like all of my neighbors are doing stuff that is making these electrical grids work, these roads be here, this computer continue to work, right? All of that action is happening in order for us to have a planetary supply chain and a network that functions. And especially if we pull the rug out of the human category there, then we also have to say, and also, there's all those plants breathing for me. And there's all of those bacteria in the soil fixing nitrogen, and the sun is churning out enormous amount of energy that is providing the basis for us to continue to churn out life, right? So the kind of provocative thing I say, and it's, the set of subtext to that autopoiesis point, is that actually I think the next scale at which life is self-organizing is the planet. And I think that our attempt to define other systems, and here's a distinction between scalar systems and any system, right? Like you can talk about a respiratory system in your body, of course, and that's a set of components that works together, right? But is that an autopoietic system? No, in fact, it can't operate on its own. I actually think our political system couldn't act on its own. A corporation, right? Exxon couldn't act on its own without the rest of the planet being in existence. And Gaia, as a name for all of the systems together, coming together and making it possible for energetic systems to flow in that way, right? It's an incredible sort of forgetting or leaving out to imagine that, IBM or Google is itself an autopoietic entity. Now you can say, yes, okay, it's a system. Yes, it's a legally recognized entity, but I want to distinguish there between just the fact that we give it a name and legal status from whether or not it is actually itself a coherent, self-contained entity. Okay. I mean, it can still be a scalar mediator, right? In fact, your respiratory system is a scalar mediator too. It's making sure that oxygen enters and carbon dioxide gets released. And that is actually a scalar mediation. I think this is what Exxon is doing, for instance. It's a scalar mediation between literally geological availability of billions of years worth of accumulated carbon that it's then making available for planetary scale alterations of energy. So sure, it's a scalar mediator. Yes, it's a legal entity in some way. Do I think it's a person, a la, the way that America, I don't know, right? But this is where I'm like, we have to sort this out a little bit more carefully between the discourses that we churn about scalar relations and the way in which a careful accounting of scale helps us sort that out and realize, again, there's the selective scale switching that we like to selectively switch to particular scales. And, I mean, as you're saying, the interlocutors who do this in relation to AI or technology systems, there's reasons that they're doing it, right? Because they want to know, how do we relate this to this? But the point of especially scale theory is to go, well, hold on a second. Be really careful about the claims you're making about control, about who is doing it. And especially, and here's the last point in response to your provocation, especially in relation to the limits of knowledge, in relation to what you know about what is happening and what you actually control. And that those are related to each other, right? Is that the limits of knowledge are also about the limits of control. Then you literally don't know what's going to happen next. But yet, the capacity to create certain technological interventions and scientific terminology gives us the feeling like we can. The nanoscientists are making carbon nanotubes. If they hadn't created that machine, the carbon nanotubes wouldn't have existed. Sure. Pushing against the fact that they think they're in control is just to note how much is left out in what they're actually doing and what they actually know about what is being done. Okay. So to apply this back to my body, because I like to do that, and then I can pass the ball back to you, is me saying that some entity here, and you can call him Josh DiCaglio, and he's, the one who has got the lease to this house and has certain children that he's legally obligated to take care of and all of these things and loves, doesn't necessarily mean that I know how these cells are working, let alone the molecules, let alone the ecology. And yet all of those things are also here and possible and doing that to make this possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I want to interpose something that I think has helped me make sense of this, which is one of my favorite papers that I read while at SFI was the information theory of individuality.
Right.
And I hear you ask this question about what is going on in the exchange of information between scales and what is actually an intervention. So just to be clear, your insistence that certain things have what we can call, even though they're not actually closed systems, that they have what Stuart Kaufman calls autocatalytic closure,
Yes.
was a huge part of our conversation about why he thinks machines are not alive and will therefore never be able to do certain things that humans do. It was a huge part of the conversation I had with Matt Segal when I asked Matt Segal if we're not making a mistake here in seeing individual robots or AI algorithms as basically, I don't know what you call them, scalar subcomponents or whatever, of
Sure.
the actual machine, which is a planet-wide machine that is alive and includes us,
That's right.
right?
That's right.
And that this is the kind of logic, just because this is the week in which they arrested Luigi Mangione. This is the problem that you're getting at, where it's, well, you can't just assassinate the head of a corporation and expect that's going to fix the problem of the fact that this system in which corporations are
Yeah.
performing some sort of
Yeah.
function decides to choose algorithms that have a 90% error rate on denying people's healthcare claims. All of that said, the information theory of individuality says, okay, well, if we define individuality information theoretically, then we can start to tease apart this question of how science can define the individual in a way that gets us closer to answering certain really thorny and persistent questions that show up well before, but come into focus through Ilya Prigogine and his work on dissipative structures, and draw a continuum between the kind of self-organization that we see in an eddy in a creek bed, which has no
Right.
DNA, it has no lineal inheritance, and yet it is a thing that we can recognize, we can specify it, even though it's obviously not ontologically separable from things like you and I, that we specify and frequently mistake as separable. And what they say is that it is a matter of the way that these entities are coupled through the exchange of mutual information with other scales, basically. That the colonial organism, like a coral reef or arguably a corporation, exists in a kind of midpoint between entities like a hurricane on one side that are entirely scaffolded by the environment, and this hypothetical modern liberal atomistic self that is utterly, you know, I think like the popular version of transhumanist discourse
Yeah.
imagines that eventually we will liberate ourselves from all obligations, limits, bodily constraints, etc. But it's like on the far end of that extreme where it's all about inheritance through time of information that is encoded in the system versus inheritance across time in an exchange of information with the environment. And that basically
Yeah. Yeah.
humans exist
Yeah.
in this sense, the way that William Gibson years ago wrote this piece on what if actually what artificial intelligence is like the reef in which we now exist as colonial organisms, which again draws a continuity between what we're doing right now with technology and what we've been doing since language gave us the affordances to fold the landscape of attention between people and coordinate us through abstractions.
Let me stop you there for a second because, okay, so first of all, I'm always super impressed by somebody like, Krakauer that's able to mathematically define these things. And I was opening that paper back up because it's been a while since I looked at it. And I'm just remembering how it, just goes into all of these equations about 4 pages in, right? Look, but on the other hand, I'm not actually always very impressed by this, right? Because this is the way in which science can operationalize, especially mathematics, can operationalize in order to very specifically, and it's very impressive, that's what's impressive about it, but to operationalize and describe in a highly particular way thresholds and moments of distinction. Honestly, I'm not sure that my math is good enough to be able to read page 215 of this, right? And so I will admit that readily, but I keep getting distracted, one might say, perhaps Krakauer would say, I don't know, by the fact that this is a mode of discourse, and I'm always wondering what it's asking me to do with reality. And this is where I get less impressed. Because look, like I can find individuality by just going to the right scale, right? Like, I mean, then that's what it's formalizing, literally, right? And that's what 215 is doing. If it was my quick read, right? Is that it's saying, like, look, like there are discernible thresholds at a particular scale where something like individuality can be sufficiently operationalized, and you can actually describe that out mathematically. Okay, if you look up what scale analysis is, this might still be the case. I haven't checked in a while. There's a Wikipedia page for scale analysis, and it's about hydrodynamics, because it turns out that when somebody is trying to figure out the pressure of water in a pipe, one could infinitely go in a finer sort of scale, but instead one uses scale analysis to literally simplify the equation so that one can calculate it. And I was like, well, what's actually happening there? Well, what they're doing is they're saying, like, at some scale, it stops mattering, right? So at some point you drop off the decimals. Okay.
Let them eat cake.
Yeah. So okay, you see what I'm getting at, right? That I'm impressed that they have these mathematical ways to describe with incredible accuracy, actually, that sort of distinctiveness is able to be formalized at different levels. But on another level, like, that's what scale does, right? You know, I'm not surprised to find, like, we forget this about quantum theory, for instance, because we love to talk about quantum theory as being about entanglement, et cetera, et cetera. But the reason that it's called quantum theory is because it's about quanta, which actually means distinctive category, right? Distinctive length. And the reason that quantum theory got going is because there wasn't supposed to be a distinctive length of relevance smaller than the atom, right? They ascribed the term atom to atomic elements because they thought they had gotten to the smallest scale. And then Einstein and others were like, oh, well, actually, you can define quanta smaller than that. And that's why it's called quantum theory, right? So that's kind of the first thing to say about some of this is functionally, it makes total sense that you can do this. I could even understand that there would be real reasons to want to do this. Okay. In fact, even to maintain something like legal frameworks, right? Legal frameworks require a functional definition of individuality. Sure, that's fine. But this is why my fundamental investment is marking the way in which these modes of describing and rendering functional are as dangerous as they are useful. And one needs to be able to see that and realize that the real difficulty for the scientists is to find the formal definition that's going to work. This is what I love. I've got it back here still, right? Jeffrey West scale came out after I had turned in the first draft of scale theory, but I was able to dress it a little bit when I was revising it for the second draft. But this is what he's so good at, right? This is why a mathematical physicist who then goes into biology can do this at different scales. He can come up with these like allometric scaling principles. He can see how they operate on cells and then organisms and then cities. And like, I'm not going to dispute those things, but this is where we get into the mantra of chapter 10 of scale theory, is that science hides a not knowing in a knowing, right? And any attempt to define that, say individuality or the next scale of relevance or something like that, or you even name it, right? Let's call it Gaia. And then immediately that term is meant to encode the entirety of the planet and all the operations going on, right? Which is just, you know, even from a kind of information perspective, there's just literally too much happening, right? There's too much happening in my own cells for me to imagine that I can process at the meter scale where this experience is being generated. It would be absurd if the brain were able to process all of that information. Okay. So here's where I would bump it back to the AI people and say, as far as I'm concerned, you know, I'm not an expert in AI in terms of how it works, but like I said, a great interest of mine and a part of my future work is to look at this point more carefully. So I'm just going to state it now, which is, okay, think about the relationship between your body, all of those cells, all of those molecules, all of that DNA, which is having to be unfolded and repackaged by ribosomes. And in order for that to happen, all of this stuff has to be there, right? And it's not just molecules in the body, but environmental factors that make it so that I have food to eat and oxygen here, right? So like if we were to follow Elon to Mars, we'd have to deal with the issue of the fact that you have to bring your atmosphere with you, right? Like these astonishing. I'm just like astonished at the way that all of these very smart people seem to be very good at forgetting the rest of reality, right? And so I would say the same thing about what's happening right now with AI. I would ask everybody, pay attention to how you're forgetting the rest of reality every time you imagine that we have created this, right? You don't have to go quite so scalar on it if you don't want to. Like in your perception and thinking, is it just your brain that does it? We've talked about this so much in this way that we can avoid the fact that actually, in order for you and I to be having this conversation, language has to exist. And in order for language to exist, the rest of human history has to have existed, right? In order for you and I to see each other, even if we were face to face, the light has to literally be there, right? And so is the seeing of you something that I am doing, or is it a description of neuronal processing, eyeball, light, object, and the seeing is actually all of those things, okay? Now, we're going to talk about AI trying to do something that we do. The problem is that we don't understand how what we do is already connected up to the rest of reality. The most dramatic version of this is David Bohm, right? Because David Bohm says this about quantum physics. He says, quantum indeterminacy isn't quite what we think it is. And I'm paraphrasing, right? He's essentially like, well, in order for us to determine what's going to happen to the electron, you need the rest of reality. But in practice, you don't really need the rest of reality because most things in reality are not actually relevant to what any given electron is going to do. But as soon as you think that, you can predict exactly where the electron is and what it is. You run into the fact that other things also had to be there and be in existence for an electron to manifest in a particular location. And then we're so thrown for a loop by the fact that, the rest of, and then we own it too. I really hate the and I'm going to say this new agey sort of version, but just to mark a kind of particular rhetorical configuration of what quantum physics means is that we control it. Because I think what Bohm is actually saying is that it's not observer, but the entirety of reality that makes the electron happen in a configuration. So this is the case with all of this stuff, right? With AI, with individuality. So here's where I'll wrap this little thread off with one more point, which is actually about the contemplative aspects here. Okay. One of the things that I would throw back to the, kind of Krakauer theory of individuality kind of question is that, okay, good. I can see that you would have reasons to operationalize individuality. There is a really important reason that nearly all wisdom traditions that I think are worth their salt, right? Maybe that's a particular category. Center the problem of false individuality, right? The ahamkara in the Sanskrit, right? Which literally etymologically means the I, aham, I am, who thinks he's the doer. Kara means to do, right? So it's the I doer, the I maker. And so many, this is actually, it was a surprise to me when I was writing this and looking at these wisdom traditions as they were thinking about and developing other scalar terminologies. So many, I can point to dozens of examples of key texts in different wisdom traditions who say, and honestly, Ramana Maharshi is probably the clearest version of this. The I emerges first and divides out the rest of reality and creates all the issues, right? You inquire into the nature of the self, what he calls ahamvriti, the I looking, and then everything unravels and you get something different, right? So this is the querying back on the attempt to render formal. This is the danger of technology, the danger of science, the danger of these articulations, is that when you find a powerful and functional way of articulating something like individuality or agency or intervention, then it's, again, to loop us back to intoxication with language, is that then it's so easy to ignore or forget or never even notice that what you have done is find a functional delimitation of reality that is actually not substantial in many ways. And there we can, as a way of summarizing this, render that more concrete, as we did at the beginning of this conversation, by saying what we mean is not something abstract. We mean literally the rest of reality. Okay?
Yeah. I've had my finger on a couple of passages from your book that you've already walked over, but you do a really good job of laying this out in the book. And first of all, we're already over time. When do you?
I'm good for till about 2. So,
Okay. All right. That gives us
3, rather 3. Yes.
Yeah, that gives us enough time, I think, for us to actually pay tribute to the transformational piece of this. To his credit, in conversation with Jeffrey West and in watching the presentations he's made internally, I think he actually embodies what you say here when you say, as one observes more and more, empiricism also begins to observe discrepancies to any law, trying to describe this assemblage of things. The result is that instead of seeking to discover the mean or medium point, you're quoting von Humboldt, you say, instead of seeking to discover the mean or median point around which oscillate in apparent independence of forces all the phenomena of the external world, this system delights in multiplying exceptions to the law. He says, the most interesting thing about this is that it reveals these anomalies,
Yeah.
and it is through the revelation of the anomalous place of human beings on that curve of biophysical scaling, the fact that human metabolism is measurably 20 times larger than you would expect for another mammal of our size because of the relationship that we have to the technium or whatever you want to call it, the
Yeah.
servers, the supply chains, et cetera, that this reveals something of interest. But in conversations with him, it does always come back to this question of now what? This question of, oh my God, I don't know what to do to get people to see how important this is and to transform people's perspective on this in a way that actually motivates us through metanoia, through
Yeah.
a scalar shift in thinking to actually change the way that we interact in the world. And I like that you put it thusly on 195. You say, if scientists expect people to change their behavior and worldview in relation to things like DNA, Buckminster fullerenes, climate change, viral vectors, or our struggling microbiomes, specifications are not simply a matter for scientists. This is not simply a matter of acceptability, authority, or truth. It's about making these objects acceptably real so that we can trace more closely the way that such specifications may or may not become the basis for new relations, new forms of speech, and new worldviews. And then you say on 219, there is an ever greater need for this task, talking about rhetoric, since in the double movement of increased specialization and more widespread use of scientific terms of knowledge, the risk of simple acceptance of articulations on the basis of doxa, just, believe science,
Yeah.
increases.
Right.
And so, yeah, before we go where we both want to go here, to take it back to the chapter, the section on mysticism versus colonialism and on nanotechnology, you say, is this digital extension really making matter manipulable? Or is this a way of narrating the extension, a fantasy contingent on the digital simulation that disguises the conditions of such extension? And later, as our value systems inevitably come into friction with these scalar tracings of science, we all need to find means of permitting our values to be transformed by these discoveries. This thing came up in the talk I gave last night, which is the question of people feeling trapped. It comes up a lot on this show. I remember hearing years and years ago Daniel Schmachtenberger on Future Thinkers podcast saying that the problem is in the gap between our ability to sense and our ability to act. And a lot of the people I speak to for
That's
Humans
right.
on the Loop, they practice tech ethics consulting and they talk
Yeah.
about how everyone within the corporation may feel that the corporation is acting out of alignment with their own individual values and no one seems able to do anything about it.
So, well, let's start there with the sense versus act thing, because that's right. So, to bring it back to that statement that I made earlier in the book, right, that one can only act at the scale at which you exist, part of the point is that scale makes us aware of all of these other different things. So, that's another way of saying the sense versus act thing. Yeah, this is why one needs to attend to these things very carefully, because in our current moment, everyone is panicking. And it's partially because we are both aware of all of these different scales and we are intervening them extensively. And so, yeah, this is why it is also important to experiment, as I think the point of the show and other forms of writing and art are trying to experiment with ways of getting us to think about and honestly face these things. That's not just about culpability, right? Like, this is the thing. when I talk to people about this, sometimes they literally get disturbed because they think that I am trying to like defray responsibility. But the very idea of responsibility replicates the scalar synecdoche so often, right? So one thing to notice, and this is really a lesson in rhetoric as far as I'm concerned, right? If I were to ask you, as we love to do in environmental rhetoric, what can you do? We love to do this. I get so annoyed when people are like, well, we want to bring it down to the practical. What difference can you make today? And here's what I would make a sort of rhetorical distinction into to use what can you do as a literal contemplative exercise, right? Instead of what it's trying to hook you into, which is a set of obligations that indulges sets of assumptions about agency and you as a human who's tied up into a democracy. The rhetoric of democracy has its own sort of idea about one's agency in the nation and all sorts of things, right? But if you literally meditate on what can you do, sit there and think about this, observe this for like an hour, and then keep it going as you walk through your day. Like literally, what can you do? And you'll realize how absurd the brain is and our culture is about this question, right? And essentially, it's another form of the you can only act at the scale which you exist, right? What can you do actually, right? Like, what can I do today? If I go and try to fix climate change, I will forget to pick up the kids in an hour. Is another way of putting it, right? And, you see how this is another version of the problem I just said in relation to science, right? Is kind of funny, right? You have mathematical models of individuality, but you also already have a set of maybe socially derived assumptions about responsibility and agency and action that sets you up for these double binds, as Bateson likes to call them. And as far as I'm concerned, the way to unravel that requires some kind of contemplative exercise. Look, I will be completely honest that I've been practicing this in relation to yoga and meditation and what I now think is a full-fledged Gnana yoga. And, to the extent that like, while I was revising scale theory, I took a Sanskrit class so I could actually dig into the Shankara and the Ribu Gita, which is one of my favorite texts that I talk about in one of those chapters, or just kind of invoke, because I realized that the amount of sitting with it that you have to do is astonishing. Here I am, like probably 15 years really in depth of like doing those practices. And I still find myself, along with the rest of us, going about my day being like, I wonder how Michael thought about my book. Is this really going to make a difference? Is this right? Like, but this is what contemplatives who are not bullshitting talk about all the time. It's like, yeah, exactly. Welcome to the self-inquiry. It's hard. It's ongoing. It requires you to be brutally honest with yourself and each other about just how much you're bullshitting yourself and others about what you can do. And it's really hard when you're trying to run a podcast and make everybody think you're really smart so that you can fund this podcast. I really respect your ability to do that. Or you're running an investor firm and you're like, oh, our lithium battery is really going to change the world, right? Like, it's all built on this kind of rhetorical sheen of like, nobody look at the fact that we're all just kind of figuring this out and we're all entangled in this scalar system, right? So there's already a rhetorical self-selection there towards egoic identification and reinforcement. But that's where it's literally killing us, right? And literally choking the planet, okay? And I like the way that Rich is, especially in the last 10 years, been talking about this as trying to cue into the like individual scale intervention and asking the question, what can you do? I mean, to your listeners, this is what I would say is, look, like, dude, if you're the guy at OpenAI doing this stuff, I want to know, what can you do? Because you can do things I can't do. If you're the regulatory, the head of the EPA, right? You can do stuff I can't do by the position that you're in within this vast system of our planet. Okay. Taking seriously, though, that there are certain things you can do, like that's also a prompting to honestly look around and say, well, what can I do? Like right now, I can write a book about this problem in relation to lithium and climate change because suddenly I find myself, surprisingly to myself, I wouldn't have expected this 10 years ago, well set up to write this very different book. But I also can raise these two kids. I can also teach some classes. But Could I go and, make my neighbor buy an EV? No. Don't worry. There's a Cybertruck who lives across the street. And can I go and stop cobalt mining in the Congo? No, I don't know, right? And this is where you see the way that the social pressure instantiates itself so quickly, right? Because the conversation starts rambling. I don't even need you to do it. They're just like, well, then you're just leaving them to like, have you really done everything that you can do? Da, 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 right? And this is why we're all just like constantly doom scrolling, as we call it, right? And first of all, I just don't do that, right? Because as you have noted in so much of your podcasts, so I'll re-articulate that a little bit, is the scalar invasion of so much information has required us to recenter on the here and now. Now, there's the contemplative exercise, right? Especially in the kind of Buddhist or Advaitin version of this, it's about the here and now and about observing the fact that part of what our amazing brains are able to do is to displace us from the here and now. And even as we get this information from all over the place about things that we're doing, and we all can see, oh my God, climate's happening. We have to develop these other ways of going, well, hold on a second. What can I actually do? What can you do? Without immediately going back to the social pressure, because we think that's our only device for making change, is controlling other people. But again, that's the scalar synecdoche. and even if I say we need to fix climate change, right? Then it's like, what do we need to do? Well, I need to make it so that my neighbor has to, right? And like, I don't know. Yes, we do need some devices, but I'm not so sure, right? I think that leads down a road towards some really scary stuff about controlling the world, about controlling people, about dictating what people can be. And like maybe to some extent that needs to happen, but here's where the scalar analog between us and ourselves makes, like, I'm actually a huge fan of the body politic metaphor if you actually treat it in terms of scale. Because, oh my God, if I were to sit down and go to each of my cells, hey, you, absorb some oxygen now. I need more bone cells over there and more fat cells over there. Oh, wait, never mind. Less fat cells, less fat. Right? But this is the way that we treat our body, and then we replicate this at the scale of the planet. And what that literally leads to is us just constantly being, Michael, what have you done today? What difference can you make in the world, Michael? And honestly, the thing that's most useful for that is just for, I don't know, innovating incubators or something, which is say extraction of value, right? We have created an insufferable framework for understanding our relationship to these scalar bits of information that we find ourselves in relation to. And so we've got to be able to pull the plug on that by forcing ourselves to be honest with the scale at which we actually act.
Yeah, totally. So in landing this, I do think that you offer very clear protocols throughout this book. If people really need to come from a place of what can I do? It's funny because, when you say it so often comes down to trying to change other people. On 205, what are we even talking about? To what does it apply? How might that be understood? How do we know it? What is not accounted for in this articulation or mode of knowing? How can we work with it? In their most productive forms, these questions hinge on wonder. And then this is the method of the current project. It began with a bewilderment. How is it possible that I am simultaneously atoms, cells, quarks, ecologies, galaxies, and a wondering, how does this apparatus function? In many ways, I can hardly get past the first detail, the basic structure of scale. I keep unfolding more considerations out of this fractal question that might simply be reduced to a word with an affect. Scale? Yet, as the breadth of this inquiry implies, such bewilderment can be productive of new avenues of discussion as we unfold the simple point in the many contexts in which it inevitably applies. So, when I think about what I'm trying to do with this show, it comes down to this thing of like, well, we need new stories. But then when we have those stories, is that adequate? Are we going to congeal and ossify around that and let the utopia become the new empire? And it's really, what, if anything, other than this contemplative prompt, can we really do, quote unquote, to affect a world in which we are giving ourselves and our children the opportunity to write their own stories? And so, yeah, when you say, may we all learn to sit in this diversity without fear and with a patient, careful, yet exuberant wonder. The last thing I'd say here is, you quote Bohm, if he thinks of the totality as constituted of independent fragments, then that is how his mind will tend to operate. But if he can include everything coherently and harmoniously in an overall whole that is undivided, unbroken, and without a border, then his mind will tend to move in a similar way, and from this will flow an orderly action within the whole.
Mhm.
It's the not doing, actually,
Yeah.
that I think you and I agree we need more of.
Right
And
here is a
thank,
quote from
yeah,
Nisargadatta. Would people know that nothing can happen unless the entire universe makes it happen, they would achieve more with less expenditure of energy.
yeah. I mean, not to reduce this to the brain, but the right brain does exist. Like evolution has demonstrated that if you want to think of everything as a utilitarian, play is purposive at the
That's right.
evolutionary
Yeah.
scale.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at risk of repeating myself, I think that this is where it connects to the problem of not knowing, right? Because we are scared when we become aware of the fact that we don't know who we are, or our language and mathematics and science are in fact limited, that we don't even know how our technology works. That is terrifying. Okay. And also we think that, again, that's more abstract than it is, which is, so there's a like legitimacy to that kind of puzzlement about when people say that, right? But like, I want to make that again very concrete by saying, no, what I mean is that with that feeling that you don't know, that you're out of control, that's just because the rest of reality is there. Right? And that is, in fact, your relationship to the rest of reality manifesting itself as a cloud of unknowing, to use that great Christian contemplative phrase. Okay. So let the rest of reality exist too. Okay. And there's ways in which Scale helps us come up with really kind of ad hoc protocols for this. Right. So I've been using this as like a, way of generating little mantras. The one I've been using in relation to that problem of planetary biofeedback is saying something like, don't panic, a la Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy,
Yeah.
right? Don't panic, the entire planet is rearranging itself, right? And I've said this out loud to people, and they freak out at me. They're like, oh no, I don't like that.
Well,
I don't
you've
like that.
prompted them with the word panic. It's like, don't make Terminators.
Well, because what you're noticing is that your panic is egoic, and that reference point to the planet puts you at tension with that very idea of agency, right? Because especially when I say this to other academics who are really concerned about being ethical, is that, it really tears the seam in a different way, right? Because it's post-human, it's not about human agency, but then it's actually about the planet rearranging itself. And what it's actually doing is taking our technological systems and giving them to the planet. And that's what's disturbing, I think, to them. But again, as a contemplative exercise, that's very interesting for getting us to pay attention to the scalar shifts that are already inherently in the way that we were talking about these kind of supply chains, environmental destruction, biodiversity loss, all these terms, right? All right, we've talked for a while.
That's good. That's a great place to let it evaporate into a cloud of unknowing. And
Yeah.
really glad we got to riff today.
Yeah, well, that sounds good. Look, I'm so excited to hear people's different ways of encountering this book. It was such a visceral experience in writing it. It came out during the pandemic when I was at home with a 3 and a 5-year-old who are now a little bit older. And so like, it was like speaking into a void itself, a cloud of unknowing, right? So it's really been wonderful to hear who is picking it up and who is finding it meaningful. Honestly, I've been delighted that some of the first people to come to me who read it were artists. It was very like, oh, you get what I'm doing. So yeah, I'm happy to continue the conversation. This has been wonderful.
Thanks, man.
All right.
Thanks again for listening. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting on your favorite podcast provider. Humans on the Loop owes its launch to O'Shaughnessy Ventures, Cosmos Institute, Imaginal Seeds, and BitTensor. If you value what's going on here, please consider contributing your listener support. Dig into the extensive archives at humansontheloop.com. And if you'd like to work together, you can email humansontheloop@proton.me. I'm devoting next week to writing grants and articles, so there will be no new episode, but there are many more to come. Stay tuned on Substack for more thoughtful provocations, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. Until then, take care, and remember, attention is our greatest natural resource.